Hands where I can see them." The shout cut through the quiet morning air, sharp and heavy. A police officer stood at the doorway of Z's diner, hand on his holster, voice filled with power and warning. "You've got 5 seconds to show ID, or we're pulling you out," he barked. The diner fell silent, coffee cups frozen midair, every head turning toward the corner booth. A black man sat alone, wearing a faded gray hoodie, calm eyes steady as the room held its breath. Behind the counter, Zariah Cole stepped forward, 25 years old, proud, steady, a woman whose silence carried more strength than shouting ever could. Her apron was crisp, her stance firm. "He's a customer," she said quietly, but with fire in her voice, "and unless ordering breakfast is a crime now, maybe you should think about who's really out of line." The officer stiffened, the air grew tight. Moments like this don't explode right away, they simmer, hidden beneath rules dressed up as respect. This wasn't about coffee, it was about dignity. At that moment, Zariah didn't just defend a man, she stood up to a system. She placed herself between a badge and a human being who hadn't even taken a bite of his food. What no one knew, not even her, was that the quiet man in that booth was Langston Drake, a tech billionaire traveling incognito. He carried his wealth in a worn backpack, and wore anonymity like armor. He hadn't said a word, until now. "Let her talk," he said, calm but commanding. And suddenly, everything changed. This is Hidden Truths, stories that reveal what lies beneath bias and courage. Before we move forward, ask yourself, what would you have done? Take a moment to like and subscribe, not for us, but so more voices like Zariah's can be heard. Because sometimes, the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to look away. Now, let's go back, before that morning, before the badge, before the stare. Zariah Cole never asked for sympathy. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in East Haven, where machines never slept, and the smell of detergent clung to everything she owned. Her mother, Denise, worked night shifts as a nurse, coming home when the sky turned pale, exhaustion in her shoulders but love shining in her eyes. Every morning she'd kiss Zariah's forehead and whisper, "You're my sunrise, baby." Her father was gone before she turned 6. No note, no goodbye, just the sound of a slammed door and a lifetime of questions. Denise filled that silence with music, old soul records spinning on repeat, and stories of strong women who built their lives from scraps and willpower. She didn't raise her daughter to be perfect. She raised her to be fierce. By 16, Zariah knew the sound of disbelief hidden inside compliments. "You're so articulate," teachers said, surprised. Store clerks watched her hands instead of her words. Strangers reached for her curls like they were theirs to touch. She smiled through it, not because it didn't hurt, but because she refused to let it own her. Her dream was simple, yet sacred, to open a bakery of her own, a place where everyone could feel safe. College was out of reach. Loans felt like chains. So she waited tables, saved every dollar, and filled a worn leather notebook with recipes and prayers, tucked beside a photo of her and her mom, both dusted in flour, both smiling like the world was still kind. Zariah had learned early how to read people, the good, the cruel, and the ones still deciding which they wanted to be. Their eyes always gave it away, that quiet judgment that spoke louder than words. The tone, the glances, the polite smiles that really meant, "You don't belong here." But Zariah did. Not loudly, not for attention, but with a grace that refused to shrink. She wore her pride like perfume, faint, but impossible to ignore. Pressed shirts, spotless sneakers, a soft shimmer of lip gloss catching the morning light. Not for anyone else, but for herself, for the woman her mother had raised her to be. And maybe that's why, on that stormy morning when the police burst into the diner and silence swallowed the room, she didn't flinch. Zariah had lived through storms before. This one just had uniforms. Most people knew Langston Drake from headlines, the billionaire genius, the visionary who built a tech empire and funded schools across the country. But the man who walked into Z's diner that morning wasn't that version of him. No suit, no entourage, no watch worth a fortune. Just a black hoodie, worn jeans, sneakers softened by time. And on his wrist, not a Rolex, but a hospital band. His rule was simple: never stand out unless you have to. And that morning, he wanted to disappear. His daughter, Maya, had gone into emergency surgery at sunrise. Complications. No promises. So while the world waited for statements, Langston drove 2 hours south until he reached a quiet town called East Haven. He stopped at the first place he saw, Z's Diner. No one recognized him. That was exactly what he needed. Because when you're a black man, even with fame and power, people still see only your skin. Take away the suit and the spotlight, and what's left is what the world chooses to see. Langston hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. As rain slid down the window beside him, he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just a father, terrified of losing his child. He didn't expect kindness. He didn't even look for it. But when those officers came in, ready to humiliate him for nothing, what caught him off guard wasn't their hostility, it was her. Zariah, a waitress who didn't know his name and didn't need to. She saw wrong, and she stepped forward anyway. For years, Langston had believed power meant control, the freedom to vanish whenever he wanted. But watching Zariah stand there, unarmed except for her voice, he understood something deeper: presence. That moment changed him. And he knew it couldn't end there. The next morning came with rain again. Zariah reached her front door and froze. An envelope was taped to the frame, no name, no return address, just one word scrawled in red marker: careful. Inside, a crumpled diner receipt, circled 3 times in thick black ink. Nothing else. Her pulse quickened. Rain dripped from the awning as she stood on the landing, heart pounding. East Haven wasn't known for violence, not the loud kind. Here, people hurt you quietly. They didn't shout. They erased you. One ignored greeting, one closed door, one missing smile at a time. By midday, the air was heavy, pressing against her skin. At the diner, regulars avoided her section. Some pretended she wasn't there. Others stared too long, waiting for her to break. Doug, her manager, found her near the dish pit, arms folded tight. "You got people watching, Z," he said. "Word is, you picked a side." Zariah lifted her chin, eyes steady. "Yeah," she said softly, "the right one." "I picked a person," Zariah said flatly. Doug's jaw tightened. "Well, that person's about to cost us customers." "People talk, Z. This isn't just about coffee anymore." She stayed silent. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You want to keep this job? Then post something neutral. Say it got blown out of proportion. Make it go away." Zariah met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "I'm not taking it back." Doug exhaled through his nose. "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised when your shifts start disappearing." That night, her phone buzzed. Her landlord. "Repairs," he said curtly. "You've got 30 days to move out." When she asked why, his tone dropped to a mutter. "You know why." Zariah sat in her dim kitchen, ceiling fan groaning above her, shadows crawling across the walls. Her phone lit up again, messages from friends, some kind, some cautious. She didn't answer. She'd made her choice. And she knew this wasn't about one man, or one diner, or one morning. It was about every time she'd been told to stay quiet, to smile, to play small. And she was done doing that. Meanwhile, miles away, in a messy college dorm where energy drink cans outnumbered textbooks, a student named Luis Chandler uploaded a shaky 58-second video to TikTok. He'd been sitting 2 booths away that morning. His phone had caught it all, Zariah standing between 2 officers and a black man in a hoodie, calm, steady, unflinching. She didn't shout. She didn't move. She stood. The caption read, "This waitress just stood up to cops for a man nobody else even looked at. Hashtag protect Zariah Cole." By the time Zariah clocked in the next morning, the video had already reached more than 1 million views. Within hours, it spread like wildfire, from TikTok to Instagram, to Twitter threads and news blogs with headlines like, "The Waitress Who Said No to Power," "Courage Over Coffee, One Woman's Stand Against Injustice." Influencers reposted it with tears in their captions. Journalists scrambled to find her. Hashtags began to rise. Hashtag Stand With Zariah. Hashtag Protect Black Women. Hashtag Coffee and Courage. And through it all, Zariah kept wiping down menus, pouring coffee, scraping plates in the back. She had no idea that millions of people had just watched her do what she thought was ordinary. At Z's diner, the morning rush passed quietly. A few extra glances, a couple of whispers, but no one spoke to her directly. The internet was roaring her name, but East Haven stayed silent. Local news hadn't touched the story. And in that town, silence still spoke the loudest. Her phone sat on the charger in the break room, notifications stacked high like a storm she couldn't face. 2 days offline. Too tired. Too drained. Too busy surviving the stairs to care about the screens. At 11:15, Doug walked past her booth with a grunt. "You're famous now," he muttered. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like a warning. Zariah blinked. "What?" Doug shoved his phone toward her. "You're all over the internet. Hope that video was worth it when the reporters start showing up." She stared at the screen. Her own face looked back, calm eyes, squared shoulders, defiance frozen in pixels. It was strange, seeing herself from the outside. She handed the phone back quietly. "I was just doing my job." Doug scoffed. "Yeah, well, now it's everybody's business." Outside, gray clouds gathered again, but the real storm had already begun. And Zariah had no idea how far the thunder would reach. On the 43rd floor of a private hospital in Atlanta, Langston Drake stood by a wall of glass, arms crossed, eyes on the skyline. The city below glowed in the fading light, but his thoughts were far away, with the waitress who had looked authority in the face and refused to bow. Behind him, machines beeped softly. His daughter, Maya, slept, finally stable after surgery. The doctors were hopeful, but Langston still felt the weight of something unfinished, something deeper than medicine. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Avery," he said when the line picked up. "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply. "I need a full background check on a woman named Zariah Cole. Works at a diner in East Haven." "Z's Diner." A pause. "Understood, sir." "May I ask why?" Langston exhaled slowly. "She stood between me and 2 cops like she didn't care if the world was watching. Didn't ask who I was. Didn't hesitate. She just did the right thing." Avery's tone softened. "Do you want me to reach out?" "Not yet," Langston said quietly. "I don't want her knowing. Not until I do this right." He turned from the window and sat beside Maya's bed. She stirred, curls tangled from restless nights. He brushed his hand through them, whispering words she couldn't hear. "She reminded me of my mother," he murmured. "Didn't flinch. Didn't perform. Just acted." "I'll have her file to you by morning," Avery replied. "Should I alert legal or press?" "No," Langston said firmly. "This isn't for headlines. It's personal." A beat of silence, then. "And Avery, one more thing." "Yes, sir?" "I want her protected." Quietly. "I don't care what it costs. If anyone comes for her, I want her shielded before she even hears the footsteps." "Understood," Avery said. Langston ended the call. The phone sat heavy in his hand, a tool of power that suddenly felt small compared to what he owed. For years, he'd measured people by profits, influence, recognition. But Zariah hadn't measured him at all. She had simply seen him. Now, he decided, it was time the world saw her. The next morning, East Haven buzzed, not with engines or chatter, but with whispers drifting through the streets like static. At Z's Diner, Zariah came in early. She hadn't checked her phone in days. The flood of notifications had turned into white noise. She didn't need strangers' opinions to know everything had changed. Doug was behind the counter, polishing glasses that were already spotless. He kept glancing at the front door, waiting, not for a customer, but for someone. And then they came. Two men in polos and dark jeans walked in quietly, taking the far booth. They didn't order. They didn't touch the menus. One of them tapped something on his smartwatch and murmured, "She's here." Zariah brought over 2 cups of coffee without asking questions. The men nodded politely, eyes flicking between her and the door. At 9:17, the door swung open again. A tall man in a navy suit stepped inside, polished shoes untouched by dirt, a gold clasp gleaming on his briefcase. He scanned the diner once, then turned and walked right back out. Doug leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "You seeing this?" Zariah nodded, drying her hands on her apron. "Yeah. None of these people are here for pancakes." By late morning, a matte black van rolled up outside. No logo, no markings, just tinted windows reflecting the cloudy sky. 2 workers wheeled in a heavy metal crate and stopped near the counter. "Is there a Zariah Cole here?" one asked. Zariah hesitated. Yeah, that's me." "This is for you," he said. "Delivery and installation already covered. No sender listed." Doug blinked. "What the hell?" The men unwrapped a brand new commercial espresso machine, sleek, spotless, gleaming under its plastic cover. Zariah stood frozen, hands still wet from the sink. Moments later, the bell above the door chimed again. A woman in her late 30s stepped inside, black suit, clipboard, Bluetooth in her ear, all business. "Miss Cole?" Zariah nodded. "This is from Mr. Drake. Personal delivery." Before Zariah could speak, the woman handed her an envelope, turned, and disappeared as quickly as she'd come. Zariah didn't open it. Not yet. She stood there, the envelope trembling in her hand, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence. Outside, people slowed as they passed the window, whispering, staring, pretending not to stare too long. The same town that once ignored her was suddenly paying attention. Something was building, something bigger than she could see. The lunch rush had barely started when the bell chimed again. Zariah was refilling napkin holders when she looked up, and froze. He stood in the doorway, caught between 2 worlds. Black suit, white shirt, no tie. The beard trimmed, the hair neat, but the eyes the same. Calm. Worn. Human. Langston Drake. It took her a second to realize it was him. Not because she'd forgotten, but because nothing about him looked like the billionaire from the headlines. No bodyguards. No cameras. Just a man walking into a small-town diner. He approached the counter quietly, his step steady but deliberate. The room fell silent, every sound swallowed by that moment. "I'm Langston," he said softly. "Langston Drake." Zariah's breath caught. Her hand stilled against the counter. I didn't know." "I know," he said gently. "That's what made it real." He looked around the diner, then back at her. "You treated me like a person when everyone else saw a stereotype. You stood up when it wasn't safe. That meant something." Zariah swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "I didn't do it because—" Langston lifted a hand, calm but firm. "You did it because it was right. And that's what matters." He reached into his jacket and placed a small envelope and a silver key on the counter. "That's the deed to this place," he said quietly. "Paid in full. In your name. No conditions. No tricks." Zariah's lips parted, but no words came. "There's more explained in the letter," Langston added. "But you don't need to read it now." Her voice trembled as she whispered, Why are you doing this?" Langston smiled, not the kind meant for cameras, but the kind that comes from truth. "Because you reminded me that money can build things," he said, "but people like you keep the world from breaking apart." He turned toward the door, paused, and looked back one last time. "Maya, my daughter, she asked me who you were," Langston said softly, his voice catching just slightly. "I told her, you're the kind of woman I hope she grows up to be." Then he stepped back into the sunlight. The bell above the door chimed once more as it closed behind him. Zariah stood behind the counter, surrounded by whispers and wide eyes. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. It wasn't just the silver key lying on the counter, though that alone would have been enough. It was what came next. When she finally opened the envelope, her breath caught. Inside was a check, not for $1,000, not $10, but $75,000. Made out to Zariah Cole. Clipped to it was a handwritten note that read, "For what you've already carried, and for what you still dream of building." Beneath the check were documents, proof of ownership transfer for the diner, a 1-year lease for a nearby commercial kitchen, fully paid, and a formal statement from Drake Holdings establishing a community entrepreneurship fund in her name. If she wanted to open her bakery, the one she'd dreamed of since she was a girl, the door was finally open. Zariah sat in the back booth, the envelope trembling in her hands, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Doug hovered nearby, mumbling something about taxes and paperwork, but his words barely landed. The kitchen door creaked open, and Joyce, the diner's longtime cook, peeked out, wiping her hands on her apron. "You okay, baby?" Zariah blinked, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "I think so, but I don't know what to do with this." Joyce stepped closer, her voice warm but firm. "You do what you've always done," she said. "You serve. You build. You bake. Only now, you've got a little help." That afternoon, another delivery arrived. A truck bearing the Drake Foundation logo pulled up outside. A crew in black polos rolled in stainless steel prep tables, new ovens, and gleaming mixers. A walk-in cooler followed, along with crates labeled Sunlight and Spice Bakery, her dream name, the one she'd only ever written in her journal. At the bottom of the last crate sat a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a flour-dusted apron, embroidered in pale blue thread with 2 simple words, Sunlight and Spice. Tucked inside the folds was a note. "You told the truth when it cost you. Now let the truth feed others." Zariah traced the stitching with her fingers, her throat tightening, not from the money, not from the shock, but from the feeling of finally being understood. For once, she wasn't surviving. She was beginning. By week's end, East Haven felt different, like the whole town was holding its breath. The same people who had whispered behind her back, who once crossed the street to avoid her, now lingered outside the diner, pretending to check their phones, pretending they hadn't read the news. But they had. Local headlines read, "From waitress to owner, Zariah Cole's rise." A small-town stand that changed everything. A black story of courage America needed. Even the local radio host ended his morning show with a soft, "We see you, Zariah." Then the bell above the door chimed again, and in walked a face she never thought she'd see. Mrs. Everett. Her old high school English teacher. The same woman who once scrawled across her essay in red ink, "Speak less. Smile more. Asterisk." She stood at the counter now, hands folded, pearls catching the diner's light. "I'd like a slice of pie," she said quietly. "And I wanted to say, I was wrong about who I thought you were." Zariah didn't smile. Not yet. She simply nodded. "What kind of pie?" Mrs. Everett hesitated, then said softly, "Whichever one you made." Word spread. And then more came, people from the town, one by one, crossing that invisible line between guilt and grace. Tommy Rutherford, the same man who once laughed when she'd been turned away from the town parade, now sat alone by the window, sipping his coffee like it was penance. A group of teenagers showed up next. Not to sneer, not to film, but to help. "We saw the video," one of them said softly. "It was real. It mattered." Then they grabbed brooms and started sweeping the sidewalk. Even Pastor Griggs, who hadn't stepped inside the diner in years, came by that afternoon. No cameras. No speeches. Just a quiet prayer whispered behind the register. Zariah didn't talk much through any of it. She just watched, measuring, listening, wondering how long this new kindness would last. But she welcomed them anyway. Not because they'd earned it, but because she remembered her mother's words. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's power with purpose. And maybe the strongest thing she could do now wasn't to shame the town, but to show it what grace looked like up close. Little by little, the walls that had boxed her in began to shift. Not crumble but bend. And for the first time, East Haven felt like a place that might actually grow. It was just after the lunch rush when the bell chimed again, soft, almost hesitant. Zariah didn't look up at first. Her hands moved automatically, wiping down the counter, lost in rhythm and thought. Then she heard it, the slow rhythm of boots. Not the stomp of authority, but the careful steps of someone trying not to be heard, yet knowing they already were. When she looked up, she froze. Officer Carla Mendez. No uniform this time, just jeans, a faded gray t-shirt, and a badge clipped loosely to her back pocket. Her hair tied back, her face bare, her expression not defensive, just tired. Human. Zariah straightened, not out of fear, but instinct. Carla gave a small nod and stepped forward. Black coffee, she said quietly. No cream. No sugar. Zariah poured the cup and slid it across the counter. Neither of them spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space, joined by the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Finally, Carla drew a slow breath. I wasn't the one who said the words, she began. But I stood there and let them be said. Zariah stayed silent. I saw what happened that morning, Carla continued, her voice low. I saw how they looked at you. And at him. And I didn't do anything. I should have. Still no response. Carla's fingers tightened around the coffee mug. I came today because you deserve to hear it out loud. I'm sorry. Zariah studied her, not just the words, but the weight behind them. The eyes that once measured her like a threat now couldn't hold her gaze for long. Finally, Zariah spoke. I don't need an apology, she said. I needed someone to act. Carla nodded slowly. I know. That's why I'm here. I want to do better. Zariah reached under the counter, pulled out a biscuit still warm from the oven, and placed it in front of her. Not with ceremony. Not with forgiveness. Just quietly. Talking's easier with food, she said. Carla smiled faintly. Thank you. Zariah didn't smile back, but her shoulders softened just a little. Because maybe real change didn't start with statements or marches. Maybe it started with showing up, setting down your pride, and taking a sip of coffee you didn't quite deserve yet. The sun was sinking behind the hills of East Haven, painting the streets in streaks of amber. Above the door, carved into the new wooden sign, were the words she had once written in her old journal. Sunlight and spice. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon rolls and honey-warm bread. Children giggled at a frosting station in the corner. Laughter echoed through the space that once held only silence and tension. And behind the counter stood Zariah Cole, once a waitress defending a stranger. Now the owner of a place built on courage, forgiveness, and something far stronger than fear. Because in the end, the truest kind of power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who keeps showing up. With open hands, steady heart, and sunlight in their soul. A man in a business suit waited patiently behind a retired schoolteacher. No uniforms. No titles. Just people, laughing, sipping, living. And there was Zariah. She moved behind the counter like she had always belonged there, calm, steady, graceful. Her apron dusted with flour, curls pulled back, cheeks glowing with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through fire and come out golden. That morning, Langston had stopped by, no cameras, no reporters. Just a father and his daughter. Maya was stronger now, her hair growing back, her smile soft but full. They sat together in the same corner booth where everything had begun. Zariah brought them fresh lemon muffins, still warm, and refused to take their money. They talked, they laughed, they lived. As the sound of plates and chatter filled the bakery, Zariah's eyes drifted to the framed photo on the wall, her and her mother, side by side in matching aprons, faces dusted with powdered sugar and hope. She thought about that morning, the one that started it all. The moment she stood between injustice and a stranger. The moment she didn't realize would become a story shared around the world. And then she understood something simple, something deep. Kindness matters most when it's given without expectation. Because we don't always get to choose our battles. But we do choose how we show up. When we stand up for others, especially when it costs us something, we give the world permission to change. One person. One moment. One act of courage at a time. So if this story moved you, even a little, let it stay with you. And if you believe the world needs more of this, join us here at Hidden Worth. Subscribe to hear more real stories of everyday bravery. And tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed kindness given without conditions? Because sometimes, those are the moments that change everything.